as spread thighs are to the libertine, flights of migratory birds to the ornithologist, the working part of his tune bit to the production machinist, so was the letter V to young Stencil. He would dream perhaps once a week that it had all been a dream, and that now he'd awakened to discover the pursuit of V was merely a scholarly quest after all, an adventure of the mind, in the tradition of the Golden Bough or the White Goddess. But soon enough he'd wake up the second, real time, to make again the tiresome discovery that it hadn't really ever stopped being the same simple-minded, literal pursuit. V ambiguously, a beast of venery, chased like the heart, hind or hare, chased like an obsolete, or bizarre, or forbidden form of sexual delight. And clownish Stencil capering along behind her, bells a jingle, waving a wooden, toy ox goad. For no one's amusement but his own. His protest to the Margravine, Dyshiev Lowenstein, suspecting V's natural habitat to be the state of siege, he'd come to Malurka directly from Toledo, where he'd spent a weeknight walking the Alcazar asking questions, gathering useless memorabilia. It isn't espionage, had been, and still was, spoken more out of petulance than any desire to establish purity of motive. He wished it could all be as respectable and orthodox as spying. But somehow in his hands the traditional tools and attitudes were always employed toward mean ends, cloak for a laundry sack, dagger to peel potatoes, dossiers to fill up dead Sunday afternoons. Worst of all, disguise itself not out of any professional necessity but only as a trick, simply to involve him less in the chase, to put off some part of the pain of dilemma on various impersonations. Herbert Stencil, like small children at a certain stage, and Henry Adams in The Education, as well as assorted autocrats since time out of mind, always referred to himself in the third person. This helped Stencil appear as only one among a repertoire of identities. Forcible dislocation of personality was what he called the general technique, which is not exactly the same as seeing the other fellow's point of view, for it involved, say, wearing clothes that Stencil wouldn't be caught dead in, eating foods that would have made Stencil gag, living in unfamiliar digs, frequenting bars or cafes of a non-Stencilian character. All this for weeks on end. And why? To keep Stencil in his place, that is, in the third person. Around each seed of a dossier, therefore, had developed an aqueous mass of inference, poetic license, forcible dislocation of personality into a past he didn't remember and had no right in, save the right of imaginative anxiety or historical care, which is recognized by no one. He tended each seashell on his submarine Skingill farm, tender and impartial, moving awkwardly about his steak preserve on the harbord, carefully avoiding the little dark deep right there in the midst of the tame shellfish, down in which God knew what lived, the island Malta, where his father had died, where Herbert had never been and knew nothing at all about because something there kept him off, because it frightened him. One evening, drowsing on the sofa in Bongo Shaftesbury's apartment, Stencil took out his one souvenir of whatever old Sydney's Maltese adventure had been. A gay, four-color postcard, a Daily Mail battle photo from the Great War, showing a platoon of sweating, kilted Gordons wheeling a stretcher on which lay an enormous German enlisted man with a great mustache, one leg in a splint and a most comfortable grin. Sydney's message read,
I feel old, and yet like a sacrificial virgin. Write and cheer me up. Father.
Young Stencil hadn't written because he was 18 and never wrote. That was part of the present Henry, the way he'd felt on hearing of Sydney's death half a year later and only then realizing that neither of them had communicated since the picture postcard. A certain Porpentine, one of his father's colleagues, had been murdered in Egypt under the Duello by Eric Bongo Shaftesbury, the father of the man who owned this apartment. Had Porpentine gone to Egypt like old Stencil to Malta, perhaps having written his own son that he felt like one other spy, who'd in turn gone off to die in Schleswig-Holstein, Trieste, Sofia, anywhere. Apostolic succession. They must know when it's time, Stencil had often thought. But if death did come like some last charismatic bestowal, he'd have no real way of telling. He'd only the veiled references to Porpentine in the journals. The rest was impersonation and dream. As the afternoon progressed, yellow clouds began to gather over Place Muhammad Ali, from the direction of the Libyan desert.
A wind with no sound at all swept up Ibrahim and across the square, bringing a desert chill into the city. For one, P.I.O., cafe waiter and amateur libertine, the clouds signaled rain. My lone customer, an Englishman, perhaps a tourist because his face was badly sunburned, sat all tweeds, ulster in expectation, looking out on the square. Though he'd been there over coffee not 15 minutes, already he seemed as permanent a landscape's feature as the equestrian statue of Muhammad Ali itself. Certain Englishmen, I knew, have this talent. But they're usually not tourists. I lounged near the entrance to the cafe, outwardly inert but steaming inside with sad and philosophical reflections. Was this one waiting for a lady? How wrong to expect any romance or sudden love from Alexandria. No tourist city gave that gift lightly. It took, how long had he been away from the meaty? 12 years. At least that long. Let them be deceived into thinking the city something more than what their bankers said it was, a pharos long gone to earthquake and the sea, picturesque but faceless Arabs. Monuments, tombs, modern hotels. A false and bastard city. Inert, for them, as I myself. I watched the sun darken and wind flutter the leaves of a glacius around Place Muhammad Ali. In the distance a name was being bellowed, Porpentine, Porpentine. It whined in the square's hollow reaches like a voice from childhood. Another fat Englishman, fair-haired, florid, did all northerners look alike? Had been striding down Rue Sharif Pacha in a dress suit and a pith helmet 2 sizes too large. Approaching Ayul's customer, he began blithering rapidly in English from 20 yards out. Something about a woman, a consulate. I shrugged. Having teamed years back, there was little to be curious about in the conversations of Englishmen. But the bad habit persisted. Rain began, thin drops, hardly more than a mist.
Hatfingen. Bring me coffee.
The fat one roared.
Hatfingen coward by sucker, you wild.
2 red faces burned angry at each other across the table. Murdy, I thought. At the table, MCU. Ah, the gross smiled. Coffee then.
Cafe you know.
On my return the two were conversing lackadaisical about a grand party at the consulate tonight. What consulate? All I could distinguish were names. Victoria Wren. Sir Alistair Wren. Father? Husband? Bongo Shaftesbury. What ridiculous names that country produced. I delivered the coffee and returned to his lounging space. This fat one was out to seduce the girl, Victoria Wren, another tourist traveling with her tourist father. But was prevented by the lover, Bongo Shaftesbury. The old one in tweed, Porpentine, was the Mercaro. The two he watched were anarchists, plotting to assassinate Sir Alistair Wren, a powerful member of the English Parliament. The peer's wife, Victoria, was meanwhile being blackmailed by Bongo Shaftesbury, who knew of her own secret anarchist sympathies. The two were music hall entertainers, seeking jobs in the grand vaudeville being produced by Bongo Shaftesbury, who was in town seeking funds from the foolish Knight Wren. Bongo Shaftesbury's avenue of approach would be through the glamorous actress Victoria, his mistress, posing as his wife to satisfy the English fetish of respectability. Fat and Tweed would enter their consulate tonight arm in arm, singing a jovial song, shuffling, rolling their eyes. Rain had increased in thickness. A wide envelope with the crest on the flat passed between the two at the table. All at once the Tweed one jerked to his feet like a clockwork doll and began speaking in Italian. A fit? But there was no sun, and Tweed has begun to sing.
Pazzo son, correte como io piango ed imploro.
Italian opera. Ayul felt sick. He watched them with a pained smile. The antic Englishman leaped in the air, clicked his heels, stood posturing, fist on chest, other arm outstretched, Kamayo Shiatopita. Rain drenched the two. The sunburned face bobbed like a balloon, the only touch of color in that square.
Fat sat in the rain, sipping at the coffee, observing me, his frolicking companion. Yule could hear drops of rain pattering on the pith helmet. At length Fat seemed to awake, arose, leaving a piastre and a million on the table of air, and nodded to the other, who now stood watching him.
The square was empty except for Muhammad Ali and the horse. How many times had they stood this way, dwarfed horizontal and vertical by any plaza or late afternoon? Could an argument from design be predicated on that instant only? Then the two must have been displaceable, like minor chess pieces, anywhere across Europe's board. Both of a color, the one hanging back diagonal in deference to his partner, both scanning any embassy's parquetry for signs of some dimly sensed opposition, lover, meal ticket, objective political assassination, any statue's face for a reassurance of self-agency and perhaps, unhappily, self-humanity. Might they be trying not to remember that each square in Europe, however you cut it, remains inanimate after all?
They turned about formally and parted in opposite directions, Fat back toward the Hotel Khedive, Tweed into Rudi Rasputin and the Turkish Quarter. Bon chance, I thought. Whatever it is tonight, bon chance. Because I will see neither of you again, that's the least I can wish. I fell asleep at last against the wall, made drowsy by the rain, to dream of one Mariam tonight, and the arid quarter. Low places in the square failed, the usual random sets of crisscrossing concentric circles moved across them. Near 8 o'clock, the rain slackened off.
Yusuf the factotum, temporarily on loan from Hotel Khedive, dashed through the failing rain, across the street to the Austrian consulate, darting in by the servants' entrance.
Late.
Shouted Meknes, leader of the kitchen force.
And so, spawn of a homosexual camel, the punch table for you.
Not a bad assignment, I thought as I put on the white jacket and combed my mustaches. From the punch table on the mezzanine one could see the whole show, down the decolletages of the prettier women. Italian breasts were the finest. Overall the resplendent muster of stars, ribbons and exotic orders. Soon, from my vantage, I could allow the first sneer of many this evening to ripple across a knowledgeable mouth. Let them make holiday while they could. Soon enough the fine clothes would be rags and the elegant woodwork crusted with blood. I was an anarchist. Anarchist and no one's fool. I kept abreast of current events, always on the lookout for any news favorable to even minor chaos. Tonight the political situation was hopeful. Sir Kitchener, England's newest colonial hero, recently victorious at Khartoum, was just now some 400 miles further down the White Nile, foraging about in the jungle. A general marchand was also rumoured in the vicinity. Britain wanted no part of France in the Nile Valley. Abdel Clauset, foreign minister of a newly formed French cabinet, would as soon go to war as not if there were any trouble when the two detachments met. As meet, everyone realized by now they would. Russia would support France, while England had a temporary rapprochement with Germany, meaning Italy and Austria as well. Bung ho, the English said.
Up goes the balloon. Yusuf, believing that an anarchist or devotee of annihilation must have some childhood memory to be nostalgic about by way of balance, loved balloons. Most nights at dream's verge he could revolve like the moon about any gaily dyed pig's intestine, distended with his own warm breath. But from the corner of his eye now, miracle. How, if one believed in nothing, could one account? A balloon girl. A balloon girl.
Hardly seeming to touch the wax mirror beneath. Holding her empty cup out to me. Zikum Bilka, good evening. Are there any other cavities you wish filled, my English lady? Perhaps he would spare children like this.
Would he? If it should come to a morning, Any morning when all the muezzins were silent, the pigeons gone to bide among the catacombs, could he rise roadless in nothing's dawn and do what he must? By conscience, must.
Oh,
She smiled.
oh thank you. Now take me, Ben.
May thy night be white as milk, as thy belly. Enough.
She bobbed off, light as cigar smoke rising from the great room below. She'd pronounced her rose with a sigh, as if fainting from love. An older man, solidly built, hair gone grey, looking like a professional street brawler in evening dress.
Victoria.
He rumbled. Victoria. Named after her queen. He fought in vain to hold back laughter. No telling what would amuse Yusuf.
My attention was distrayed to her now and again throughout the evening. It was pleasant amid all that glittered to have something to focus on. But she stood out. Her color, even her voice, was lighter than the rest of her world, rising with the smoke to me, whose hands were sticky with Chablis punch, mustache a sad tangle. I had a habit of unconsciously trimming the ends with my teeth. Meknes dropped by every half hour to call me names.
If one happened to be near shot, we traded insults, some coarse, some ingenious, all following the Levantine pattern proceeding backward through the other's ancestry, creating extempore at each step or generation an even more improbable and bizarre misalliance.
Count Kevin Houlimech, the Austrian consul, had been spending much time in the company of his Russian counterpart, M. de Villers. How, I wondered, can two men joke like that and tomorrow be enemies? Perhaps they'd been enemies yesterday. I decided public servants weren't human. I shook the punch ladle at the retreating back of Meknes. Public servant indeed. What was I, Yusuf, if not a public servant? Was I human? Before I'd embraced political nihilism, certainly. But as a servant, here, tonight, them, I might as well be a fixture on the wall. But that will change.
He smiled, grim.
Soon I was daydreaming again at balloons. At the bottom of the steps sat the girl, Victoria, center of a curious tableau. Seated next to her was a chubby blonde man whose evening clothes looked shrunken by the rain.
Standing facing them at the apices of a flat isosceles triangle were the grey-headed man who'd spoken her name, a young girl of 11 in a white shapeless frock, and another man whose face looked sunburned. The only voice Yusuf could hear was Victoria's.
My sister. My sister is fond of rocks and fossils, Mr. Goodfellow.
The blonde head next to her nodded courteously.
Show them, Mildred.
The younger girl produced from a reticule a rock, turned and held it up first to Victoria's companion and then to the red face beside her.
This one seemed to retreat, embarrassed. I reflected that I could blush at will and no one would know. A few more words and the red face had left the group to come loping up the stairs.
To Yusuf he held up 5 fingers, Kamsar. As Yusuf busied himself filling the cups, someone approached from behind and touched the Englishman lightly on one shoulder. The Englishman spun, his hands balling into fists and moving into position for violence. Yusuf's eyebrows went up a fraction of an inch. Another street fighter. How long since he'd seen reflexes like that? In Tufik the assassin, 18 and apprentice tombstone cutter, perhaps. But this one was 40 or 45. No one, Yusuf reasoned, would stay fit that long unless his profession demanded it. What profession would include both the talent for killing and presence at a consulate party? An Austrian consulate at that. The Englishman's hands had relaxed. He nodded pleasantly.
Lovely girl,
The other said. He wore blue-tinted spectacles and a false nose. The Englishman smiled, turned, picked up his 5 cups of punch and started down the stairs. At the second step he tripped and fell, proceeded whirling and bouncing, followed by sounds of breaking glass and a spray of Chablis punch, to the bottom.
I noted that he knew how to take falls. The other street fighter laughed to cover the general awkwardness.
Saw a fellow do that in our musical once,
He rumbled.
You're much better, Porpentina. Really?
Porpentine extracted a cigarette and lay while smoking where he'd come to rest. Up on the mezzanine, the man with the blue eyeglasses peeked archly from behind a pillar, removed the nose, pocketed it and vanished. A strange collection. There is more here, Yusuf guessed. Had it to do with Kitchener and Marchand? Of course it must. But his puzzling was interrupted by Magnez, who had returned to describe Yusuf's great-great-grandfather and grandmother as a one-legged mongrel dog who fed on donkey excrement and a syphilitic elephant, respectively. The Fink restaurant was quiet, not much doing. A few English and German tourists, the penny-pinching kind whom it was never any use approaching, sat scattered about the room, making noise enough for Midain, plus Muhammad Ali, Maxwell Rollerbug, hair coiffed, moustaches curled and external clothing correct to the last wrinkle and thread, sat in one corner, back to the wall, feeling.
The first shooting pains of panic begin to dance about my abdomen. For beneath the careful shell of hair, skin and fabric lay hold in grey linen and a ne'er-do-well's heart. Old Max was a peregrine and penniless at that. Give it a quarter of an hour more, I decide. If nothing promising comes along, I shall move on to the Universe. I had crossed the border into Baedeker land some 8 years ago in '90, after an unpleasantness in Yorkshire. I had been Ralph McBurgess then, a young lock and bar, come down to the then wide enough horizons of England's vaudeville circuits. I sang a bit, danced a bit, told a number of passable barnyard jokes. But Max or Ralph, I had a problem, being perhaps too daft for small girls.
This particular girl, Alice, had shown at age 10 the same halfway responses, a game, she'd carol, such fun of her predecessors. But they know, Max told himself.
No matter how young, they know what it is, what they're doing. Only they don't think about it that much. Which was why I drew the line at 16 or so. Any older in romance, religion, remorse entered, blundering stage hands, the ruin of pure pas-de-deux.
But this one had told her friends, who became jealous, one at least enough to pass it on to the clergyman, parents, police, oh God. How awkward it had been.
Though I'd try not to forget the tableau dressing room in the Athenaeum Theatre, a middle-sized town called Lardwick in the Fen. Bare pipes, worn sequined gowns hung in a corner. Broken hollow pasteboard pillar for the romantic tragedy the vaudeville had replaced.
A costume box for their bed. Then footsteps, voices, a knob turning so slow.
She'd wanted it. Even afterward, dry-eyed among a protective cordon of hating faces, the eyes had said, I still want it. Alice, the ruin of Ralph McBurgess. Who knew what any of them wanted? How I had come to Alexandria, where I would go on leaving, little of that could matter to any tourist. I am that sort of vagrant who exists, though unwillingly, entirely within the Baedeker world, as much a feature of the topography as the other automata, waiters, porters, cabmen, clerks. Taken for granted, I am about my business, caging meals, drinks, or lodging. A temporary covenant would come into effect between myself and my touch, by which Max was as a well-off fellow tourist temporarily embarrassed by a malfunction in Cook's machinery. A common game among tourists. They knew what I was, and those who participated in the game did so for the same reason they haggled at shops or gave backsheesh to beggars. It was in the unwritten laws of Baedeker land. I am one of the minor inconveniences to an almost perfectly arranged tourist state. The inconvenience is more than made up for in color.
Things now began to burst into life. Max looked up with interest. Merrymakers were coming across Rue Rosette from a building which looked like an embassy or consulate. Party there must have only now broken up. The restaurant was filling rapidly. Max surveyed each newcomer, waiting for the imperceptible nod, the high sign. He decided at last on a group of 4, 2 men, a small girl and a young lady who, like the gown she wore, seemed awkwardly bouffant and provincial. All English, of course. Max had his criteria.
He also had an eye, and something about our group disturbed him. After 8 years in the supranational domain, he knew a tourist when he saw one. We, girls, were almost certain, but our companions acted wrong, lacking a certain assurance and instinctive way of belonging to the touristic part of Alexandria common to all cities, which even the green show their first time out. But it was getting late and Max had nowhere to stay tonight, nor had he eaten.
His opening line was unimportant, being only a choice among standard openers, each effective as long as the touches were eligible to play.
It was the response that counted. Here it came out close to what he'd guessed.
The 2 men, looking like a comedy team, one fair and fat, the other dark, red-faced and scrawny, seemed to want to play the gay dog. Fine, let them. I knew how to be gay. During the introductions my eyes may have stayed a half-second too long on Mildred Wren.
But I'm myopic and stocky. Nothing of that told Alice and me.
An ideal touch, all behaved as if they'd known me for years. But I somehow feel that through some horrible osmosis the word was going to get round. Winging on the wind to every beggar, vagrant, exile by choice and peregrine at large in Alexandria that the team of Porpentine and Goodfellow, plus the Wren sisters, were sitting at a table in the Fink. This whole hard-up population might soon begin to drift in one by one, each getting the same sort of reception, drawn into the group cordially and casually as a close acquaintance who had left but a quarter of an hour before. I am subject to visions. It would go on, into tomorrow, the next day, the next. They would keep calling for waiters in the same cheery voices to bring more chairs, food, wine. Soon the other tourists would have to be sent away. Every chair in the Fink would be in use, spreading out from this table in rings, like a tree trunk or rain puddle. And when the Fink's chairs ran out, the harassed waiters would have to begin bringing more in from next door and down the street and then the next block, the next quarter. The seated beggars would overflow into the street. It would swell and swell. Conversation would grow to enormity, each of the participating bringing to it his own reminiscences, jokes, dreams, looninesses, epigrams, and entertainment. A grand vaudeville. They'd sit like that, eating when hunger came, getting drunk, sleeping it off, getting drunk again. How would it end? How could it? She'd been talking, the older girl, Victoria, white as flour gone perhaps to her head. 18, I guessed, slowly giving up my vision of vagrant's communion. About the age Alice would be, now. Was there a bit of Alice there? Alice was of course another of my criteria. Well, the same queer mixture, at least, of girl at play, girl in heat. Blithe and so green.
I am Catholic. Had been to a convent school near my home. This is my first trip abroad.
She talked perhaps over much about her religion, had indeed for a time considered the Son of God as a young lady will consider any eligible bachelor, but had realized eventually that of course he was not, but maintained instead a great harem clad in black, decked only with rosaries. Unable to stand for any such competition, Victoria had therefore left the novitiate after a matter of weeks, but not the church, that, with its sad-faced statuary, odors of candles and incense, formed along with an Uncle Evelyn, the foci of her serene orbit.
The uncle, a wild or renegade sundowner, would arrive from Australia once every few years, bringing no gifts but my wonderful yarns. As far as Victoria remembered, I'd never repeated myself.
More important perhaps, I was given enough material to revolve between visits to private back of beyond, A colonial doll's world I could play with and within constantly, developing, exploring, manipulating. Especially during Mass, for here was the stage or dramatic field already prepared, serviceable to our seed-time fancy.
So it came about that God wore a wide-awake hat and fought skirmishes with an aboriginal Satan out at the antipodes of the firmament, in the name and for the safekeeping of any Victoria. Now Alice, it had been her clergyman, had it not? She was CV, sturdy English, future mother, apple cheeks, all that. What is wrong with you, Max? I ask myself. Come out of that costume box, that cheerless past talkative and amusing. This one's only Victoria. But what was there about her? Normally in gatherings like this I could be talkative, amusing. Not so much by way of paying for my meal or kip as to keep fit, retain the fine edge, the knack for telling a good yarn, and gauging my own rapport with the audience in case I could go back into the business. There were touring companies abroad, even now, 8 years aged, eyebrow line altered, hair dyed, the mustache, who know me. What need for exile? The story had spread to the troupe, and through them to all smaller and provincial England. But they'd all loved me, handsome, jolly Ralph. Surely after 8 years, even if I were recognized. But now I find not much to say. The girl dominated conversation, and it was the kind of conversation I had no knack for. Here were none of your post-mortems on the day past, vistas, tombs, curious beggars. No bringing out of small prizes from the shops and bazaars, no speculation on tomorrow's itinerary, only a passing reference to a party tonight at the Austrian consulate. Here instead was unilateral confession, and Mildred contemplating
a rock with trilobite fossils she'd found out near the site of the fizz.
The other two men listening to me but yet off somewhere else, switching glances at each other, at the door, about the room. Dinner came, was eaten, went. But even with a filled belly Max could not cheer up.
They were somehow depressing. I felt disquieted. What had I walked into? It showed bad judgment, settling on this lot.
My God.
From Goodfellow. They looked up to see, materialized behind them, an emaciated figure in evening dress, whose head appeared to be that of a nettled sparrow hawk.
The head guffawed, retaining its fierce expression. Victoria bubbled over in a laugh.
It's Hugh?
She cried, delighted.
Indeed.
Came a hollow voice from inside somewhere.
Hugh Bongo Shaftesbury,
said Goodfellow, ungracious.
Harmachus.
Bongo Shaftesbury indicated the ceramic hawk's head.
God of Heliopolis and chief deity of Lower Egypt. Utterly genuine, this, a mask, you know, used in the ancient rituals.
He seated himself next to Victoria. Goodfellow scowled.
Literally Horus on the horizon, also represented as a lion with the head of a man. Like the Sphinx.
Oh?
Victoria said, that languid oh.
The Sphinx.
How far down the Nile do you intend to go?
Asked Porpentine.
Mr. Goodfellow has mentioned your interest in Luxor.
I feel it is fresh territory, sir. No first-rate work around the area since Gribot discovered the tomb of the Theban priests back in 91. Of course one should have a look round the pyramids at Gaza, but that is pretty much old hat since Mr. Flinders Petrie's painstaking inspection of 16 or 17 years ago.
Now what was this? Max wondered. An Egyptologist was he, or only reciting from the pages of his Baedeker? Victoria poised prettily between Goodfellow and Bongo Shaftesbury, attempting to maintain a kind of flirtatious equilibrium. On the face of it, all normal.
Rivalry for the young lady's attentions between us two, Mildred the younger sister, Porpentine perhaps a personal secretary. For Goodfellow did have the affluent look. But beneath,
he came to the awareness reluctantly. In Baedeker land one doesn't often run across imposters. Duplicity is against the law, it is being a bad fellow. But they were only posing as tourists. Playing a game different from Max's, and it frightened him. Talk at the table stopped. The faces of the three men lost whatever marks of specific passion they had held. The cause was approaching their table, an unremarkable figure wearing a cape and blue eyeglasses.
Hello Lepsius, tired of the climate in Brindisi, did you?
Sudden business called me to Egypt.
So the party had already grown from 4 to 7. Max remembered his vision. What quaint manner of peregrine here, these two. He saw a flicker of communication between the newcomers, rapid and nearly coinciding with a similar glance between Porpentine and Goodfellow. Was that how the sides were drawn up? Were there sides at all? Goodfellow sniffed at his wine.
You're a traveling companion,
he said at last.
We'd rather hope to see him again.
Gone to Switzerland,
Lepsius said.
Of clean winds, clean mountains. One can have enough, one day, of this solid south.
Unless you go far enough south. I imagine far enough down the Nile one gets back to a kind of primitive spotlessness.
Good timing, Max noted. And the gestures preceded the lines as they should. Whoever they were, it was none of your amateur night. Lepsius speculated.
Doesn't the law of the wildebeest prevail down there? There are no property rights. There is fighting. The victor wins all. Glory, life, power and property, all.
Perhaps. But in Europe, you know, we are civilized. Fortunately, jungle law is inadmissible.
Odd, neither Porpentine nor Bongo Shaftesbury spoke. Each had bent a close eye on his own man, keeping expressionless.
Shall we meet again in Cairo then?
Most certainly.
Nodding. Lepsius took his leave then.
What a queer gentleman.
Victoria smiled, restraining Mildred, who'd cocked an arm preparing to heave her rock at his retreating form. Bongo Shaftesbury turned to Porpentine.
Is it queer to favor the clean over the impure?
It may depend on one's employment,
was Porpentine's rejoinder.
An employer.
Time had come for the thing to close up. Bongo Shaftesbury took the check with an alacrity which amused them all. Half the battle, thought Max. Out in the street he touched Porpentine's sleeve and began an apologetic denunciation of cooks. Victoria skipped ahead across Ruka Reef Patcher to the hotel. Behind them a closed carriage came rattling out of the drive beside the Austrian consulate and dashed away Helfer leather down Rue de Rosette. Porpentine turned to watch it.
Someone is in a hurry,
Bongo Shaftesbury noted.
Indeed,
said Goodfellow. The three watched a few lights in the upper windows of the consulate.
Quiet though.
Bongo Shaftesbury laughed quickly, perhaps a bit incredulous.
Here. In the street.
A fiver would see me through.
Max had continued, trying to regain Porpentine's attention.
Oh.
Vague.
Of course, I could spare it.
Fumbling naively with his wallet. Victoria watched them from the curb opposite.
Do come along,
she called. Goodfellow grinned.
Here, and dear.
And started across with Bongo Shaftesbury. She stamped her foot.
Mr. Porpentine.
Porpentine, 5 quid between his fingertips, looked around.
Do finish with your cripple. Give him his shilling and come. It's late.
The white wine, a goes to Valis, first doubts that Porpentine was genuine. All could contribute to a violation of code. The code being only, Max, take whatever they give you. I had already turned away from the note which fluttered in the street's wind, moved off against the wind. Limping toward the next pool of light, I sensed Porpentine still looked after me. Also knew what I must look like, a little hauled, less sure of my own memory's safety and of how many more pools of light I could reasonably expect from the street at night.
The Alexandria and Cairo Morning Express was late. It puffed into the Gare du Caire slow, noisy, venting black smoke and white steam to mingle among palms and acacias in the park across the tracks from the station house.
Of course the train is late.
Wildetta the conductor snorted good-naturedly at those on the platform. Tourists and businessmen, porters from Cooks and Gazers, poorer, third-class passengers with their impedimenta, like a bazaar. What else did they expect?
7 years I'd made the same leisurely run, and the train had never been on time. Schedules were for the line's owners, for those who calculated profit and loss. The train itself ran on a different clock, its own, which no human could read. I was not an Alexandrian. Born in Portugal, I now lived with a wife and 3 children near the railroad yards in Cairo. My life's progress had been inevitably east. Having somehow escaped the hothouse of my fellow Sephardim, I flew to the other extreme and developed an obsession with ancestral roots. Land of triumph, land of God. Land of suffering, also. Scenes of specific persecution upset me. But Alexandria was a special case. In the Jewish year 3554 Ptolemy Philopator, having been refused entrance to the temple at Jerusalem, returned to Alexandria and imprisoned many of the Jewish colony there. Christians were not the first to be put on exhibition and mass murdered for the amusement of a mob. Here Ptolemy, after ordering Alexandria's Jews confined in the hippodrome, embarked on a 2-day debauch. The king, his guests and a herd of killer elephants fed on wine and aphrodisiacs. When all had been up to the proper level of bloodlust, the elephants were turned loose into the arena and driven upon the prisoners. But turned goes the tale on the guards and spectators instead, trampling many to death. So impressed was Ptolemy that he released the condemned, restored their privileges, and gave them leave to kill their enemies.
Wildetta, a highly religious man, had heard the story from his father and was inclined to take the common-sense view. If there is no telling what a drunken human will do, so much less a herd of drunken elephants. Why put it down to God's intervention? There were enough instances of that in history, all regarded by Wildetta with terror and a sense of his own smallness.
Noah's warning of the flood, the parting of the Red Sea, Lot's escape from annihilated Sodom. Men, he felt, even perhaps Sephardim, are at the mercy of the earth and its seas. Whether a cataclysm is accident or design, they need a God to keep them from harm. The storm and the earthquake have no mind. Soul cannot command or soul. Only God can. But elephants have souls. Anything that can get drunk, I reasoned, must have some soul. Perhaps this is all soul means. Events between soul and soul are not God's direct province, they are under the influence either of fortune or of virtue. Fortune had saved the Jews in the hippodrome.
Merely trains hardware for any casual onlooker. Wildetta in private life was exactly this mist of philosophy, imagination, and continual worry over his several relationships, not only with God, but also with Nita, with their children, with his own history. There's no organized effort about it, but here remains a grand joke on all visitors to Wildeta's world. The permanent residents are actually humans in disguise.
This secret is as well kept as the others, that statues talk, though the vocal Memnon of Thebes, certain sunrises, being indiscreet, that some government buildings go mad and mosques make love. Passengers and baggage aboard, the train overcame its inertia and started off only a quarter of an hour behind schedule toward the climbing sun. The railway from Alexandria to Cairo describes a rough arc whose chord points southeast. But the train must first angle north to Scarlet Lake Mariotis.
While Wildetta made his way among the first-class compartments to gather tickets, the train passed rich villages and gardens alive with palms and orange trees. Abruptly these were left behind. Wildetta squeezed past a German with blue lenses for eyes and an Arab deep in conversation, in time to enter a compartment and see from the window momentary death, the desert. The site of the ancient Lursis, a great mound, looking like the one spot on earth fertile Demeter had never seen, passed by to the south.
At City Gable, the train swung at last toward the southeast, inching slow as the sun. Zenith and Cairo would in fact be reached at the same time. Across the Mamadiya Canal, into a slow bloom of green, the delta, and clouds of ducks and pelicans rising from the shores of Mayottes, frightened by the noise. Beneath the lake were 150 villages, submerged by a man-made flood in 1801, when the English cut through an isthmus of deserts during the siege of Alexandria, to let the Mediterranean in. I liked to think that the waterfowl soaring thick in the air were ghosts of Fellerheen. What submarine wonders at the floor of Mayottes? Lost country, houses, hovels, farms, water wheels, all intact. Did the narwhal pull their plows? The villfish drive their water wheels. Down the embankment a group of Arabs lazed about, evaporating water from the lake for salt. Far down the canal were barges, their sails brave white under the sun. Under the same sun Nita would be moving now about our little yard, growing heavy with what I hoped would be a boy. A boy could even it up, 2 and 2. Women outnumber us now, I thought. Why should I contribute further to the imbalance? Though I'm not against it, I'd once told her during our courtship, partway here, in Barcelona, when I was stevedoring at the docks. God's will, is it not? Look at Solomon, at many great kings. One man, several wives.
Great king?
She yelled.
Who?
We both started to laugh like children.
One peasant girl you can't even support.
Which is no way to impress a young man you are bent on marrying. It was one of the reasons I fell in love with you shortly afterward and why we'd stayed in love for nearly 7 years of monogamy. Nita. The mind's picture was always of her seated behind our house at dusk, where the cries of children were drowned in the whistle of a night train for Suez, where cinders came to lodge in pores beginning to widen under the stresses of some heart's geology. Your complexion is going from bad to worse. I'd say, I'll have to start paying more attention to the lovely young French girls who are always making eyes at me.
Fine.
She thought.
I'll tell that to the baker when he comes to sleep with me tomorrow. It'll make him feel better.
Where all the nostalgias of an Iberian littoral lost to them, the squid hung to dry, nets stretched across any sky glow morning or evening, singing or drunken cries of sailors and fishermen from behind only the next looming warehouse.
Find them, find them. Voices whose misery is all the world's night.
Came unreal, in a symbolic way, as a racketing overpoints, a chaff of inanimate breath, and had only pretended to gather among the pumpkins, porcelain and cucumbers, date palm, roses and poinsettias of their garden. Halfway to the Marnier I heard a child crying from a compartment nearby. Curious, I looked inside. She was English, 11 or so, nearsighted, her watering eyes swam distorted behind thick eyeglasses. Across from her a man, 30 or so, harangued. Another looked on, perhaps angry, his burning face at least giving the illusion. The girl held a rock to her flat bosom.
A doll which does everything perfectly, because of the machinery inside. Walks, sings, jumps rope. Real little boys and girls, you know, cry, act sullen, won't behave.
His hands lay perfectly still, long and starved, nervous, one on each knee.
Bongo Shaftesbury.
The other began. Bongo Shaftesbury waved him off, irritated.
Come. May I show you a mechanical doll? An electromechanical doll.
Have you won?
She was frightened, Waldetta thought with an onrush of sympathy, seeing his own girls. Damn some of these English.
Have you one with you?
I am one.
Bongo Shaftsbury smiled and pushed back the sleeve of his coat to remove the cufflink. He rolled up the shirt cuff and thrust the naked underside of his arm at the girl. Shiny and black, sewn into the flesh, was a miniature electric switch.
Single pole, double throw recoiled and stood blinking. Thin silver wires ran from its terminals up the arm, disappearing under the sleeve.
You see, Mildred, these wires run into my brain. When the switch is thrown the other.
Papa.
The girl cried.
Everything works by electricity. Simple and clean.
Stop it,
said the other Englishman.
Why, Porpentine?
Viscous.
Why? For her. Touched by her fright, are you? Or is it for yourself?
Porpentine seemed to retreat bashfully.
One doesn't frighten a child, sir.
Hurrah! General principles again.
Corpse fingers jabs in the air.
But someday, Porpentine, I, or another, will catch you off guard. Loving, hating, even showing some absent-minded sympathy. I'll watch you. The moment you forget yourself enough to admit another's humanity, see him as a person and not as symbol, then perhaps.
What is humanity?
You ask the obvious. Ha, ha. Humanity is something to destroy.
There was noise from the rear car, behind Wildetta. Porpentine came dashing out and they collided. Mildred had fled, clutching her rock, to the adjoining compartment. The door to the rear platform was open. In front of it a fat florid Englishman wrestled with the Arab Wildetta had seen earlier talking to the German. The Arab had a pistol. Porpentine moved toward them, closing cautiously, choosing his point. Wildetta, recovering at last, hurried in to break up the fight. Before he could reach them, Porpentine had let loose a kick at the Arab's throat, catching him across the windpipe. Arab collapsed rattling.
The fat Englishman had taken the pistol.
Now.
Porpentine pondered. What is the trouble?
Wildetta demanded in his best public servant's voice.
Nothing.
Porpentine held out a sovereign.
Nothing that cannot be healed by this sovereign cure.
Wildetta shrugged. Between them they got the Arab to a third-class compartment, instructed the attendant there to look after him, he was sick, and to put him off at Damania. A blue mark was appearing on the Arab's throat. He tried to talk several times. He looked sick enough.
When the Englishmen had at last returned to their compartments, I fell into a reverie which continued on past the Marne, where I saw the Arab and blue-lensed German again conversing.
Through Anna Windetta, the sun rose at about noon and the train crawled toward Cairo's principal station. As dozens of small children ran alongside the train calling for backsheesh. As girls in blue cotton skirts and files, with breasts muddy sleek brown by the sun, trailed sit down to the Nile to fill their water jars. As water wheels spun and irrigation canals glittered and interlaced away to the horizon. As feline languished under the palms. As buffalo patsied their everyday tracks round and round the Zakis.
The point of the green triangle is Cairo. It means that, relatively speaking, assuming your train stands still and the land moves past, that the twin wastes of the Libyan and Arabian deserts to the right and left creep in inexorably to narrow the fertile and quick part of your world until you are left with hardly more than a right-of-way, and before you
so they crept in on the gentle Wildetta of suspicion, cheerless as the desert. If they are what I think, what sort of world is it when they must let children suffer?
Thinking, of course, of Manoel, Antonia and Maria, my own.
That creeps in on a man's land. Not a fella, but he does own some land. Did own. From a boy, he has repaired the wall, mortared, carried stone heavy as he, lifted, set in place. Still the desert comes. Is the wall a traitor, letting it in? Is the boy possessed by a jinn who makes his hands do the work wrong?
Is the desert's attack too powerful for any boy, or wall, or dead father and mother? No, the desert moves in. It happens, nothing else. No jinn in the boy, no treachery in the wall, no hostility in the desert. Nothing. Soon, nothing. Soon only the desert. The two goats must choke on sand, nuzzling down to find the white clover. Never to taste their soured milk again. The melons die beneath the sand. Never more can you give comfort in the summer, cool Abdelawi, shaped like the angel's trumpet. The maize dies and there is no bread. The wife, the children grow sick and short-tempered. The man, he runs one night out to where the wall was, begins to lift and toss imaginary rocks about, curses Allah, then begs forgiveness from the Prophet, then urinates on the desert, hoping to insult what cannot be insulted. They find him in the morning a mile from the house, skin glued, shivering in a sleep which is almost death, tears turn to frost on the sand. And now the house begins to fill with desert, like the lower half of an hourglass which will never be inverted again. What does a man do?
Gabriel shot a quick look back at his fare. Even here, in this Becky garden at high noon, these horses' hooves sounded hollow. You jolly damn right, Glizzy. A man comes to the city and drives for you and every other Frank with land to return to. His family lives all together in a room no bigger than your WC, out in Arabian Cairo, where you never go because it's too dirty, and not curious.
Where the street is so narrow hardly a man's shadow can pass, a street like many not on any guidebook's map. Where the houses pile up in steps, so high that the windows of two buildings may touch across the street, and hide the sun. Where goldsmiths live in filth and 10 tiny flames to make adornment for your traveling English ladies.
5 years Gabriel had hated them. Hated the stone buildings and metal rows, the iron bridges and glass windows of Shepherd's Hotel, which it seemed were only default forms of the same dead sound that had taken his home.
The city, I often told my wife, just after admitting I'd come home drunk and just before beginning to yell at my children, the 5 of them curled blind in the windowless room above the barber like so many puppy bodies, the city is only the desert in disguise. The Lord's angel, Gabriel, dictated the Quran to Muhammad the Lord's prophet. What a joke if all that holy book were only 23 years of listening to the desert. A desert which has no voice. If the Quran were nothing, then Islam was nothing. Then Allah was a story, and his paradise wishful thinking. Fine. The fair leaned over my shoulder, smelling of garlic, like an Italian.
White hair.
But dressed like an Inglese. How horrible the face looked. Dead skin peeling off the burned face in white rags. We were in front of Sheffiard's hotel. Since noon we'd been all over the fashionable part of the city. From Hotel Victoria, where, oddly, my fare had emerged from the servants' entrance, we had driven first to the Quarter Rossetti, then a few stops along the Musky, then uphill to the Round Point, where I waited while the Englishman disappeared for half an hour into the bazaar's pungent labyrinth. Visiting, perhaps. Now I'd seen the girl before, surely. The girl in the Quarter Rossetti, Coptic probably. Eyes made impossibly huge with mascara, nose slightly hooked and bowed, 2 vertical dimples on either side of the mouth, crocheted shawl covering here and back, high cheekbones, warm brown skin. Of course she'd been a fair. I remembered the face. She was mistress to some clerk or other in the British consulate. I had picked the boy up for her in front of the Hotel Victoria, across the street. Another time they'd gone to her rooms. It helped me to remember faces. Brought in more bakshish if you bury them good day any second time. How could you say they were people? They were money. What did I care about the love affairs of the English? Charity, selfless or erotic, was as much a lie as the Quran. Did not exist. One merchant in the Musky too I had seen. A jewel merchant who had lent money to the Mahdists and was afraid his sympathies would become known now that the movement was crushed. What did the Englishman want there? He had brought no jewels away from the shop, though he'd remained inside for nearly an hour.
Gabriel shrugged.
They were both fools. The only Mahdi is the desert. Muhammad Ahmad, the Mahdi of 83, was believed by some to be sleeping not dead in a cavern near Baghdad. And on the last day, when the Prophet Christ re-establishes Islam as the religion of the world, he will return to life to slay Dajjal the Antichrist at a church gate somewhere in Palestine. The angel Israfil will trumpet a blast to kill everything on earth, and another to awaken the dead. But the desert's angel had hidden all the trumpets beneath the sand. The desert was prophecy enough of the last day.
Gabriel lounged exhausted against the seat of his pint-colored phaeton. He watched the hindquarters of the poor horse. The poor horse's ass. He nearly laughed. Was this a revelation then from God? Haze hung over the city.
Tonight, I would get drunk with an acquaintance who sold sycamore figs, whose name I didn't know.
The fig hawker believed in the last day. Saw it, in fact, close at hand.
Rumors,
he said darkly, smiling at the girl with the rotting teeth, who worked the Arabian cafes looking for love-needy Franks with her baby on one shoulder.
Political rumors.
Politics is a lie.
Far up the Bahar el Abyad, in the hidden jungle, is a place called Fashoda. The Franks Inglesi, Faransawi will fight a great battle there, which will spread in all directions to engulf the world. And Asrafil will sound the call to arms.
Snorted Jibrail.
He cannot. He is a lie, his trumpet is a lie. The only truth is the desert, Wahyat Abu. God forbid. And the pig hawker went off into the smoke to get more brandy. Nothing was coming. Nothing was already here.
Back came the Englishman, with his gangrenous face. A fat friend followed him out of the hotel.
Bedtime.
The fair called mirthfully.
Ha, ho. I'm taking Victoria to the opera tomorrow night.
Back in the cab.
There is a chemist's shop near the Credit Lyonnais.
Weary Jibrail gathered the reins. Night was coming rapidly. This haze would make the stars invisible. Brandy, too, would help. Jibrail enjoyed starless nights. As if a great lie were finally to be exposed. 3 in the morning, hardly a sound in the streets, and time for Gitches the mountebank to be about his nighttime avocation, burglary. Breeze in the acacias, that was all. Gitches huddled in bushes, near the back of Shepherd's Hotel. While the sun was up, he and a crew of Syrian acrobats and a trio from Port Said, dulcimer, Nubian drum, reed pipe, performed in a cleared space by the Ismaili Canal out in the suburbs near the slaughterhouse of Abbasiyal. A fair.
There were swings and a fearsome steam-driven carousel for the children, serpent charmers, and hawkers of all refreshment, toasted seeds of abdalawi, limes, fried treacle, water flavored with licorice or orange blossom, meat puddings. My customers were the children of Cairo and those aged children of Europe, the tourists. Take from them by day, take from them by night. If only my bones weren't beginning so much to feel it. Performing the tricks, with silk kerchiefs, folding boxes, a mysteriously pocketed cloak decorated outside with hieroglyphic plows, scepters, feeding ibis, lily and sun, sleight of hand and burglary needed light hands, bones of rubber.
But the clowning, that took it out of him. Harden the bones, bones that should be alive, not rock rods under the flesh. Falling off the top of a motley pyramid of Syrians, making the dive look as near fatal as it actually was. Or else engaging the bottom man in a slapstick routine so violent that the whole construction tottered and swayed. Mock horror appearing on the faces of the others. While the children laughed, shrieked, closed their eyes or enjoyed the suspense.
That was the only real compensation, I suppose. God knew it wasn't the pay. A response from the children, buffoon's treasure. Enough, enough. Best get this over, I decided, and to bed as soon as possible.
One of these days he'd climb up on that pyramid so exhausted, reflexes off enough, that the neck-breaking routine would be no sham. Gitches shivered in the same wind but cool the acacias. Up, he told his body, that window. And was halfway erect before he saw his competition.
Another comic acrobat, climbing out a window some 10 feet above the bushes Burgess crouched in. Patience, then. Study his technique. We can always learn. The other's face, turned in profile, seemed wrong, but it was only the streetlight. Feet now on a narrow ledge, the man began to inch along crab-like, toward the corner of the building. After a few steps, stopped, began to pick at his face. Something white fluttered down, tissue thin, into the bushes. Skin, I shivered again. I had a way of repressing thoughts of disease. Apparently the ledge narrowed toward the corner. The thief was hugging the wall closer. He reached the corner. As he stood with each foot on a different side and the edge of the building bisecting him from eyebrows to abdomen, he lost his balance and fell. On the way down he yelled out an obscenity in English. Then hit the shrubbery with a crash, rolled and lay still for a while. A match flared and went out, leaving only the pulsing coal of a cigarette. I was all sympathy. I could see it happening to myself one day, in front of the children, old and young. If I'd believed in signs, I would have given it up for tonight and gone back to the tent we all shared near the slaughterhouse. But how could I stay alive on the few millions tossed my way during the day? Mountebank is a dying profession, I'd reckon, in my lighter moments. All the good ones have moved into politics. The Englishman put out his cigarette, rose and began to climb a tree nearby. I lay muttering old curses. I could hear the Englishman wheezing and talking to himself as he ascended, crawled out on a limb, straddled it and peered in a window. After a lag of 15 seconds, I distinctly heard the words,
"A bit thick, you know."
From the tree. Another cigarette coal appeared, then abruptly swung in a quick arc downward and hung a few feet below the limb. The Englishman was swinging by one arm from the limb. This is ridiculous, I thought. Crash! The Englishman fell into the bushes again. I got cautiously to my feet and went over to him.
Bongo Shaftesbury?
The Englishman said, hearing Gidge's approach. He lay looking up at a starless zenith, picking absently at flakes of dead skin on his face. Gidges stopped a few feet away.
Not yet.
The other continued.
You haven't got me quite yet. They are up there, on my bed, Goodfellow and the girl. We have been together now for 2 years, and I can't begin, you know, to count all the girls he has done this to. As if every capital of Europe were Margate, and the promenade a continent long.
He began to sing.
It isn't the girl I saw you with in Brighton, who's your lady friend?
Mad, I thought, pitying. The sun hadn't stopped with this poor fellow's face, it had gone on into the brain.
She will be in love with him, whatever the word means. He will leave her. Do you think I care? One accepts his partner as one does any tool, with all its idiosyncrasies. I had read Goodfellow's dossier, I knew what I was getting. But perhaps the sun, and what is happening down the Nile, and the knife switch on my arm, which I did not expect. And the frightened child, and now.
He gestured up at the window he'd left.
Have thrown me off. We all have a threshold. Put your revolver away, Bongo Shaftesbury, there's a good fellow, and wait, only wait. She's still faceless, still expendable. God, who knows how many of us will have to be sacrificed this coming week. She is the least of my worries. She and Goodfellow.
What comfort could I give him? My English wasn't good, I'd only understood half the words. The madman had not moved, had only continued to stare at the sky. I opened my mouth to speak, thought better of it, and began to back away. I realized all at once how tired I was, how much the days of acrobatics took out of me. Would that alienated figure on the ground be me someday? I'm getting old, I thought. I have seen my own ghost. But I'll have a look at the Hotel du Nil anyway. The tourists there aren't as rich. But we all do what we can.
The beer hole north of the Speckeyard Garden had been created by North European tourists in their own image. One memory of home among the dark-skinned and tropical. But so German as to be ultimately a parody of home. Anne had held on to the job only because she was stout and blonde. A smaller brunette from the south had stayed for a time, but was finally let go because she didn't look German enough. A Bavarian peasant, but not German enough. The whims of Bobelik, the owner, got only amusement from him.
Bred to patience, a barmaid since age 13, she had cultivated and perfected a vast cow-like calm which served her now in good stead among the drunkenness, sex for sale and general fatuousness of the beer hall. To the bovine of this world, this tourist world, at least, love calms, is undergone, and goes away as unobtrusive as possible. So with Anne and the itinerant Lepsius. A salesman, said he, of ladies' jewellery. Who was she to question? having been through it. Her phrase, "Han," schooled in the ways of an unsentimental world, knew well enough that men were obsessed with politics almost as much as women with marriage. Knew the
beer hall to be more than a place to get drunk or fixed up with a woman. He gused as its list of frequent customers did comprise individuals stranger to Carl Baedeker's way of life. How upset Böglich would be, could he see my lover. I moaned about the kitchen now, in the slug period between dinner and serious drinking, up to my elbows in soapy water. Lepsius was certainly not German enough.
Half a head shorter than him, eyes so delicate that he must wear tinted glasses even in the murky Bublix, and such poor thin arms and legs.
There is a competitor in town,
he confided to her.
Pushing an inferior line, and selling us, it's unethical, don't you see?
She nodded.
Well, if he came in. Anything you happened to overhear? A rotten business, nothing I apostrophe ever want to subject a woman to. But for my poor weak eyes, my loud snoring, my boilic way of mounting you, taking too long to come to rest in the embrace of your fat legs.
Of course, I would go on watch for any competitor. English he was, and somewhere he'd got a bad touch of the sun. All day, through the slower morning hours, my hearing seemed to grow sharper. So that at noon when the kitchen erupted gently into disorder, nothing would right. A few delayed orders, a dropped plate which shattered like my tender eardrums, it stirred perhaps more than I was intended to. Verschoder, verschoder. The word washed about Böglichs like a pestilent rain. Even the faces changed. Krone the chef, Wernher the bartender, Musa the boy who swept floors, Lotte and Eva and the other girls, all seemed to have turned shifty, to have been hiding secrets all this time. There was even something sinister about the usual slap on the buttocks Böglich gave me as I passed by. Imagination, I told myself. I'd always been a practical girl, not given to fancy. Could this be one of love's side effects? To bring on visions, encourage voices which did not exist, to make the chewing and second digestion of any cut only more difficult? It worried me, who thought I knew everything about love. How was Lepsius different? A little slower, a little weaker. Certainly no high priest at the business, no more mysterious or remarkable than any other of a dozen strangers. Them men and their politics. Perhaps it was a game of sex for them. Didn't they even use that same word for what man does to a woman and what a successful politician does to his unlucky opponent? What was Fasoda to me, or Marchand or Kitchener, or whatever their names were, the two who had met for what? I laughed, shaking my head. I could imagine, for what. I pushed back a stubble of yellow hair with one soap-bleached hand. Old how the skin dyed and grew so white. It looked like leprosy. Since midday a certain leitmotif of disease had come jittering in, had half revealed itself, latent in the music of Cairo's afternoon. Verschoder, verschoder, a word to give pain, unspecific headaches, a word suggestive of the Ungols, and outlandish Milchkroginisms, and Fivirts, which were not Lovitz the only aid known, after all, being a healthy girl or anything humans. Was it a change in the light, or were the skins of the others actually beginning to show the blotches of disease? I rinsed and stacked the last plate. No. Then. Back went the plate into the dishwater. I scrubbed it, then examined the plate again, tilting it toward the light. The stain was still there. Hardly visible. Roughly triangular, and extended from an apex near the center to a base an inch or so from the edge. A sort of brown color, outlines indistinct against the faded white of the plate's surface. I tilted the plate another few degrees toward the light and the stain disappeared. Puzzled, I moved my head to look at it from another angle. The stain flickered twice in and out of existence. I found that if I focused my eyes a little behind and off the edge of the plate, the stain would remain fairly constant, though its shape had begun to change outline. Now crescent, now trapezoid. Annoyed, I plunged the plate back into the water and searched among the kitchen gear under the sink for a stiffer brush. Was the stain real? I didn't like its color. The color of my dike. Pallid brown. It is a stain, I told myself. That's all it is. I scrubbed fiercely. Outside, the beer drinkers were coming in from the street.
Hannah
called böglich. Oh God, would it never go away? I gave it up at last and stuck it the plate with the other dishes. But now it seemed the stain had fusioned and transferred like an overlay to each of my retina. A quick look at my hair in the mirror fragment over the sink. Then on went a smile and out went I to wait on my countryman. Of course the first face I saw was that of the competitor. It sickened me. Mottled red and white, and loose wisps of skin hanging. He was conferring anxiously with Vacuumian the pimp, whom I knew. I began to make passes.
Lord Cromer could keep it from avalanching.
Sir, every whore and assassin in Cairo.
In the corner someone vomited. I rushed to clean it up.
If they should assassinate Cromer.
Bad show, to have no consul general.
It will degenerate.
Amorous embrace from a customer. Bublik approached with a friendly scowl.
Keep him safe at all costs.
Capable men in this sick world are ill.
Bongo Shaftesbury will try.
The opera.
Specky Garden.
The opera. Manala Scott.
Who did say? I know her. Zenobia the Copt.
Kenneth Slime with the embassy's girl.
Love. She paid attention.
Has it from Slime that Cromer is taking no precautions? My God, good fellow, and I barged in this morning as Irish tourists, he in a mouldy morning hat with a shamrock, I in a red beard. They threw us bodily into the street.
No precautions. Or God.
God, with a shamrock. Good fellow wanted to lob a bomb.
As if nothing could wake him up. Doesn't he read the...
A long wait by the bar while Werner and Muzzer tapped a new keg. The triangular stain swam somewhere over the crowd, like a tongue on Pentecost.
Now that they have met.
They will stay, I imagine, round.
The jungle's round.
Will there be, do you think?
If it begins it will be round.
Where?
Fashoda.
Fashoda.
I continued on my way, through the establishment's doors and into the street. Krone the Weiter found me 10 minutes later leaning back against a shop front, gazing on night garden with my yard eyes.
Come.
What is Fashoda, Krone?
Shrug.
A place. Like Munich, Weimar, Kiel. A town, but in the jungle.
What does it have to do with women's jewelry?
Come in. The girls and I can't handle that herd.
I see something. Do you? Floating over the park.
From across the canal came the whistle of the night express for Alexandria.
Bitte.
Some common nostalgia, for the cities of home. For the train or only its whistle. May have held them for a moment. Then the girl shrugged and they returned to the beer hall. Vacuumian had been replaced by a young girl in a flowered dress.
The lab pro Englishman seemed upset. With fulminant resourcefulness I rolled eyes, thrust bosoms at a middle-aged bank clerk seated with cronies at the table next to the couple. Received and accepted an invitation to join them.
I followed you.
The girl said.
Papa would die if he found out.
Anne could see her face, half in shadow.
About Mr. Goodfellow.
Pause. Another pause.
So that he may know.
Then,
your father was in a German church this afternoon. As we are now in a German beer hall. Sir Alistair was listening to someone play Bach. As if Bach were all that were left.
She hung her head, a moustache of beer foam on her upper lip. There came one of those queer lulls in the noise level of any room. In its center another whistle from the Alexandria Express.
You love Goodfellow,
he said.
Yes.
Nearly a whisper.
Whatever I may think, I have guessed. You can't believe me, but I must say it. It's true.
What would you have me do, then?
Twisting ringlets round her fingers.
Nothing. Only understand.
How can you?
Exasperated.
Men can get killed, don't you see, for understanding someone the way you want it. Is your whole family daft? Will they be content with nothing less than the heart, lights and liver?
It was not love.
I excused myself and left. It was not, man, woman.
The stain was still with her. What could she tell Lepsius tonight?
I had only the desire to remove his spectacles, snap and crush them, and watch him suffer. How delightful it would be.
This from gentle Hannah Schertz. Had the world gone mad with fasciata? The corridor runs by the curtained entrances to 4 boxes, located to audience right at the top level of the summer theater in this Beckier garden.
The red curtains, heavy velvet swing to and fro, unsynchronized, after my passage. The oscillation soon dumps out because of the weight. They hung still. 10 minutes pass.
2 men turn the corner by the allegorical statue of tragedy. Their feet crush unicorns and peacocks that repeat diamond fashion the entire length of the carpet. The face of one is hardly to be distinguished beneath masses of white tissue which have obscured the features, and changed slightly the outlines of the face. The other is fat. They enter the box next to the one the man with the blue spectacles is in. Light from outside, late summer light now falls through a single window, turning the statue and the figured carpet to a monochrome orange. Shadows become more opaque.
The air between seems to thicken with an indeterminate color, though it is probably orange.
Then a girl in a flowered dress comes down the hall and enters the box they occupied. Minutes later she emerges, tears in her eyes and on her face. The fat man follows. They pass out of the field of vision. The silence is total.
So there's no warning when the red and vitified man comes through my curtains holding a drawn pistol. The pistol smokes. He enters the next box. Soon he and the man with the blue spectacles, struggling, pitch through the curtains and fall to the carpet.
Their lower halves are still hidden by the curtains. The man with the white blotched face removes the blue spectacles, snaps them in two and drops them to the floor. The other shuts his eyes tightly, tries to turn his head away from the light.
Another has been standing at the end of the corridor. From this vantage he appears only as a shadow. The window is behind him. The man who removed the spectacles now crushes, forcing the prostrate one's head toward the light. The man at the end of the corridor makes a small gesture with his right hand.
The crouching man looks that way and half rises. A flame appears in the area of the other's right hand. Another flame. Another. The flames are colored a brighter orange than the sun.
Vision must be the last to go. There must also be a nearly imperceptible line between an eye that reflects and an eye that receives. The half-crouched body collapses. The face and its masses of white skin loom ever closer. At rest, the body is assumed exactly into the space of this vantage.
Bye.